many Christians, especially in the 21st century United States, have been in churches and have been taught a theology and a view of the Bible that I don't think the Bible espouses. So there's a big separation between the sacred things and the secular things, and specifically when it comes to the material world. Most people envision where God is as non-material, but where we live is the stuff. And I think when God's there, the material world's here, then clearly that's better. And by inference, this is less. And so a lot of the views of the Bible, when people talk about worldliness, they end up, I think, unbiblically speaking about all of life as worldly, when in fact that's not what the Bible does at all. It speaks about worldliness as a distorting and a twisting of real life in the material creation. So I just think it's the reason most Christians do it. I don't think most of them are even thoughtful enough to make those theological connections, but it's the water they've swam in. So honestly, I think it probably sits at the feet of the teachers. And it's one of the things I take seriously of why God says, not many of you aspire to be teachers, for you'll infer a stricter judgment. And I think it's the demise of discipleship and the mission of the church that's true. Pastors and teachers in churches and curriculums, to be honest with you, have really contributed to it by speaking about the Christian faith in this very spiritualized terminology, and that's missed the physical. So one of my favorite passages always to go to reveal this is Romans chapter 12, and to say to people when you think about spiritual worship, like if you were going to be very spiritual in your worship, what would you do? And a lot of people would think about their eyes closed and their hands raised, or them privately in a corner with a cup of coffee and Jesus, and saying, that's not at all what Paul actually says. And, so Paul's statement after this great, grand, argument in Romans is, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, for this is your spiritual act of worship. And then I'll go, so if he's saying present your bodies, what do you do that's not in your body? And everyone will kind of get quiet, and I'll go, you brush your teeth in your body, you eat in your body, you raise kids, or you're parented, if you're a kid, in your body, you go to school in your body. Like, there's nothing you don't do in your body. So what is Paul really saying spiritual worship is? He's saying it's your whole life. It's everything you do being presented to God. And that's spiritual worship. So the connection between body and spiritual worship, just in one verse, immediately goes, well, that's not what I've been taught at all. I've been taught worship's closing my eyes and raising my hands, but I'm not saying that's not a part of it, or your personal devotion times isn't. But that's clearly, Paul's saying it's way more than that. One, I think immediately the character of God, distinct Christian view is that God's triune, so that at a fundamental level, everything in the world's communal, and nothing that you do is ever individual. So there's a tendency when we come and move from vocation to your immediate profession, especially with the rise of the tech industry, there's a tendency for people to think about their individual work. I'm at a computer screen, I don't have a lot of communication time with people, to immediately think about an individual without ever thinking of the implications of the coding that they do, that develops the website, that creates connections and or disconnects people from each other. So I think at one point, the triune nature of God communicates, and this is a word people typically would never apply to this, but economy. And what a true economy is a connected community, that in the end, currency goes along with that. So to me, it's fundamentally communal. God is communal, and so therefore, your work always has implications to your neighbor, no matter what you're doing, always, for good or ill. And the question people would have in that. I think the second one is we only know God by how he displays himself, and he's always displaying himself as a worker. So in creation, the idea of God's getting his hands dirty, making things and creating things, giving us a creation mandate, and specifically as image bearers of God. So I don't think you can ever understand your full human vocation, let alone your profession, outside of really understanding who God is, and that God's a worker and he's a designer and a restorer. So I think he gives us that in the creation mandate of be creative, rule and subdue the earth, that kind of idea of stewarding it, but then also there's a clear element of restoration all throughout God, that I think that's a fundamental, it's in his nature. God didn't just respond to sin and bad things and disorder by going, oh, what do I do now? But his very nature is Savior. His very nature is restorer. So I think there's a part of restoring broken things being fundamental to what it means to be human, and the way in which that directly relates to whatever we do at any point in our life being a part of our vocation. This is probably an area I don't want to say most, I'm very passionate about, because I think anytime you bring up the word creation with Christians, at least in our context of the West, people immediately go to things like environmentalism and immediately go to that and see all of the problems within it, and therefore kind of begin to take creation and go, that's kind of, I'm not sure I want to buy that or want to get into it. And yet, the Bible's really clear. Colossians 1, Hebrews 1, God in Christ, all things consist, which means all things hold together. And Hebrews 1 is that he's upholding all things by the word of his power. So at the end of the deal, when you look at creation, one, I'd say immediately you have to think beyond the trees, that creation is anything we can see. God's the creator of all things. You know, the book of Hebrews says that too, that the builder of all things is God, or Colossians 1, again, that he's created all things are created by him and for him, kind of an idea. So if creation's made by God, it's upheld by God, and it's made for God, then in the end, there's a huge part, Psalm 119, Psalm 19, about how you see God in the midst of creation. And I would argue pretty vehemently that you can't understand creation, which is simple, feet to the street level way to say that is the real world, without a true understanding of God. And I think, again, Psalm 19 and 119 really declare that. So to me, the view of creation and our role within the creation is worship. I mean, that's what the Bible defines as worship, is the way we live our everyday lives as created members, creatures, in the midst of God's creation is fundamentally what he means by worship. So I think that's a huge part. The other part of creation is just, Calvin has this quote that literally every atom of the universe, which sometimes we have to slow down and go, so what's an atom? What's made up of atoms? Okay, everything. But that there's not an atom of the universe that doesn't display the sparks of the glory of God. And he then goes on and has this really provocative statement in which he says, to the godly of heart and to the godly of mind, they may legitimately say nature is God. Which feels like, immediately if you know worldview at all, you go, that's a pantheist. We don't worship the creation, which, there's a clear creator, creature, or creation distinction in Christianity. But what Calvin's getting at the end is that if God's that central to the creating and upholding of, we're not deists, we don't believe he removed himself, but he's immanent in all of creation. Herman Bavinck says, if that's true, then every morning we awake and say, this is the day that the Lord has made, it doesn't take me 3 seconds to look around at anything that I see and see God immanent in the midst of all of the atoms. And I just think what that does for the Christian life of devotion has a huge opportunity to elevate your joy if you see God in the midst of everything. I think it allows us to be far more grateful. I think it allows us to live in far more wonder, which I think those two things alone enable an opportunity for a world that uses the creation for its own selfish pleasure, and therefore there's a lack of gratitude and a lack of wonder that when they see people, it provides the opportunities of 1 Peter of giving an account for the hope that lies within you. They're far more likely to ask questions about your awe, your astonishment, your gratitude that way when you see God in the midst of everything. You could as simply define it as Jesus' command to love your neighbor as yourself. And this is another hot button for me. So the idea of loving God, every Christian would say, and honestly, many other faith traditions would even say that's the highest ideal, to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But the Bible does this amazing thing, Old and New Testament, where it combines so intricately love for God and love for neighbor. And at the end of the day, I think a fundamental tie of the creation mandate that he gives to Adam and Eve of be fruitful and multiply means there's going to be more humans. And the rule in subduing is always a level of the way in which you're going to love God is by creating an atmosphere, whatever word you want to say, an atmosphere, a world, an ecology, if you wanted to, that humans can flourish in the most. And that to me is the fundamental call, is when we view love of neighbor in everything that we do. I would argue the loving God by loving your neighbor is the logic of the New Testament all the time. You will display your love for God in your love for your neighbor, and the only way I can do that is in the real stuff. And so that's from coding to a barista making a coffee to an attorney general trying to determine the direction of a state or of a nation. So it's from the highest to the lowest. So that'd be one way I'd say it. The simplest command is to love your neighbor as yourself. I think the other one that I really believe is a call of the human vocation is the Micah 6:8 passage. So, and I think that's very clear as, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God, and viewing justice and righteousness as not just what we're supposed to do in a world of sin, but even pre-sin, there was a way to do things rightly and ordered, and that would be the doing righteousness or doing justice. Loving mercy. I think, again, some of these things, I think we come up with problems because we only define them post-fall or post-sin, when in reality, I think they're fundamental, back to the last question, the character of God. And then obviously always walking humbly with God, which is the fundamental thing Adam and Eve don't do, which is what leads them into sin, is pride. Say to people, so if you're doing your job, how do you fulfill the greatest of all the commandments? To love God with all you have and to love your neighbor as yourself. And one of the times I'll just say, if you think about being a barista at a coffee shop, how do you think you would most love God and honor God in your work of making espresso drinks or making coffee? And people sit and go, I think probably doing the best work I could. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's going to mean, I pour out the best quality milk I could possibly have. I steam it just to the right temperature, and the temperature wand's right there. I know how much the milk's supposed to be steamed to be hot but not burnt. I finish it off. Then I take the espresso, put the espresso on top, and in the midst of that, then, when you go to these really good coffee shops, they'll make a little artistic design at the end of it. So that at the end, it's like, to God, almost like a child would be when they come home and have their A+ work, like, here you go, and a parent's like, the way you're gonna honor God is to do the best work you possibly can in the midst of that. And then I'll go, okay, now answering the question, how do you make that same drink to love your neighbor the best way? Well, it's probably by giving them the best drink they could. So at the end of the day, you steam the milk to the best way possible. You pull the best shots with the crema on top. You pour the shots in, then you do the milk, and you pour the heart out. You pour it across, and you've loved them when they look at it and kind of laugh like, oh, wow, that's a heart, or that's a leaf. And they kind of get joy, and they look at you and smile. And then when they take it and go, that's the best latte I've ever had in my life. At that moment, like, I've just served them. They're coming back, which is good for your business. And then I'll say, and then you, because you want to be happy and you want to experience joy. So what's the way at your job you're going to have the most joy? And every time they'll go, well, basically the same way I'm going to love God. Like, when I give that person that drink, I know before the Lord, I've worked heartily as unto the Lord, and I know I've served my neighbor, and it gives me this deep, resounding satisfaction. Well, that's true if you're an accountant, that's true if you're an architect, that's true if you're a teacher. It's the same thing. When you make that holistic connection for people, your joy, God's glory, and your love in service of your neighbor are the same thing through your job. That's just incredibly, it makes people enjoy their work more, for sure. A lot of people have the discouragement of, like, the church isn't doing their job. And one of the things I always try to tell them is, I think that's true in terms of teaching the truth about this. But the other thing is, the whole waters we swim in when we leave in this are dualistic. They separate secular from sacred. I mean, the fundamental pursuit of secularism is to suck God out of everything. Well, if I'm a Christian and I go, I think God's immanent in everything and he's in every atom, and you're removing God from that, that's a really hard world, even for the most committed Christian to live in. And I think in the end, as I was saying before, I think it sucks wonder, I think it sucks gratitude, and the end for me of secularism is selfishness. I mean, there's no way at the end of this, it can't just be about this is material stuff for my needs. It's really hard to make an argument for, considering the needs of others is more significant than your own, or to live in the midst of the mundane with divine wonder when God's not a part of it. So I think it's just it's an extraordinarily difficult culture. I would argue even more difficult than spiritual and yet off and distorted spiritualism cultures, because at least in those cultures, there's an awareness of the spiritual realm. I mean, when you just outright cut that out entirely, I think it may be the most dehumanizing thing anybody can do, which is why I think, the Psalms would say something like, only the fool says there is no God. I don't think that's just foolishness like, you dumb people. I think it's literally like, you're absolutely foolish. Like, this is the most unhuman thing, an unrealistic thing. It's the most unrealistic thing, and yet we live in a culture that looks at you if you believe in God and says, you're the most unrealistic thing. I mean, it's an incredible irony, tragedy, not irony. Yeah, I mean, I think immediately, and this would be pressed back upon in many churches, but I think immediately it means the very work that you do on a Monday through Friday level is mission at a very significant level. And I believe that to the core of my being. Even if somebody said, well, the mission of the church is to make more disciples, well, then you immediately have to go, well, what's discipleship? And if discipleship is only the spiritual things I do or the words of evangelism that I speak, which I'm for all of those. I mean, I lead a church, we do worship. It's a huge part of what we do. We're training our people to do evangelism. But what it does for people when they understand you're doing the work of ministry in the very way in which you're a painter, in the very way that you're a plumber, all the way to the very way you're a teacher, is incredibly liberating to them. So to me, if God is reconciling and restoring all things to himself, and the church fundamentally is not about bringing the kingdom, but witnessing and testifying to the kingdom, then what Christians do on an ongoing basis is saying in everything they do, this is what life looks like under the rule and reign of Jesus, which biblically speaking would be, this is the way God always intended the world to operate and people to function. So that could be everything from, this is what race relations look like, this is what marriage relationships look like, this is what the family looks like when Jesus is king. That is a massive part of God putting the church, as one famous book says, the church between gospel and culture. If the gospel is about the reconciliation and restoration of all things, and your culture's over here, what the church is meant to represent is the kingdom to the world, of going, this is what God's always intended. And even when we fail, that's the beauty of, even when we fail of living out Christ's lordship in all of life, the beauty is the Lord's a savior, and we get to put that on display to people as well, so. Take both of those, for instance. I think this is one of the areas the faith and work conversation has not been as good as a lot of people's critique of it is it's a grass tops. They talk all about the elite. They either talk about artistic, like craftsmanship of coffee, or they talk about a business professional or an architect. But the reality is you have all these people in blue-collar jobs. So take those two, for instance, a painter. I mean, immediately the work of restoration, of paint that's falling off a place that we're repainting and re-beautifying it, not just for the owner of that, but for all the passersby that now see it, that in the midst of my very work, I'm doing something that's very much like God, that in the end is serving my neighbor and understanding that. And the idea of, in painting, I could cut a corner and maybe not a lot of people know, but in the end, I'm working heartily as unto the Lord and not for men, and God's going to be honored for that. I'm going to get more joy. And in the end, there's going to be a moment months later or years later where somebody looks up and goes, did they never paint that corner? And then they get frustrated, like, I paid the money for that. So to a painter, it's as significant of that, of which I think it is determined by your joy, your service to your neighbor, and not just the immediate. A highway, somebody that's building a highway, I mean, you could think about it in the pouring of the concrete, but even the thought of what it's going to do in the building of the highway to save time for people, the ability that streets that are done well are far safer, which likely will provide fewer accidents, a far better commute in the midst of this, that you don't have the worries, and even could cut down time that people are with friends more often or have better opportunities to recreate or whatever that is. And those are the things I just don't think even, I have a friend of mine that owns a company that makes fasteners for light fixtures on streets. So he sells to cities that are putting up, and never made these connections. And still you start going like, what about the girl that has to walk home after her job at the restaurant down the street to walk down a lit street versus a dark street? Crime's gonna decrease, she's gonna feel safer, people are gonna perceive it. It's just she'll fall less because she can see where she's going. Is when you take the reality of loving your neighbor and the idea of we do live as a community, that's the idea of a civitas or a polis, all these things matter to loving our neighbors specifically, and therefore loving God, that I just think we have not slowed people down long enough to really help them think through how practical all of this is. I was talking to a fireman the other day that was talking about, and I was asking him the direct question, what did this theology do for you? And he said, when I became a Christian, I felt like I needed to work hard in order to get a platform to do evangelism. Like that was the whole point, like work, whatever. He said, what began to change for me is understanding it as worship and serve of neighbor. So he said, every time I go in to my station, I have to clean the bay where the trucks are. And he said, forever it was the most monotonous thing in the world. Like, I gotta do it, you gritted your teeth, this is not what I like to do, but I need to do it, and I need to do it well. And in the end, hopefully people will see my hard work and give me an opportunity to share with them Jesus. But he said, I don't want to deny any of that being true, but it sucks the dignity fundamentally of, one, how I'm serving and loving the chief, the station, how I'm bringing order to the cleaning of the bay ultimately, and again, what it did for my delight. And then, we had this conversation where essentially the idea that came out was, your work will never be a platform for evangelism at its fullest degree, maybe at all, until it's more than a platform for evangelism. And that to me is like, in the more than a platform for evangelism, I have to be really strong because I believe these things are so integrated, you don't ever want to separate them. But the issue is like, your worshiping and being a disciple is much with nobody in the bay when you're cleaning it as you are when you walk back into the station around the guys and how you represent it. That's worship. And I think God's very clear. We'll give an account for all of that to him. And so I think that's where the cultural mandate and the Great Commission, if you take through the lens of just the Great Commission and just slowed down long enough and asked yourself questions, because we've allowed what people taught us to fill in the meaning rather than what it's really saying. So if the Great Commission is all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, right? And then you take the passages that we've mentioned of Colossians 1 of if Christ's authority is not just over the mission of the church, but all of creation. And when he's saying all authority has been given unto me, and that's what Hebrews does, quoting the Psalms of, God placed all things under his feet and then gave him to be head, this is Ephesians, over all things to the church, right? And then it says the church, of which is the fullness of him who fills all things in every way. So the role of the church then is literally filling all things in every way to display the authority of Christ. We'll immediately go like, well, how do we fill all things? It's like, well, God sends us into the education arena. He sends us into all spheres of society to represent him specifically. So immediately you just go, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore, go make disciples in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. Well, then if you just slow down long enough and go, well, if his authority is that over all things, and we're made in his image, what is a disciple? Fundamentally, a follower of him. And then you make these connections of like Romans 8, which most people know from Romans 8:28, that he works all things together for good. But then you go, well, what's the good? 8:29 says, he's predestined us to be conformed into the likeness of his son. So discipleship is literally it's not just following Jesus, but it's being like him in the midst of this, the one who has authority over all things. So now discipleship gets beefed up. And this is my critique of a lot of the Christians that will say things like, well, no, the mission of the church is to go into all the world, making disciples by proclaiming the gospel under the authority of the local church. And I want to go, I don't disagree with anything you just said. What I do disagree with is how truncated you've made discipleship and evangelism. Like, I just think you've truncated it way beyond what the Bible ever said, and you've made it almost an unhuman activity. Like the spiritual, I don't even know what it means in the end, and it doesn't. So now I proclaim a gospel to people that don't feel like it's relevant, because truth be told, it isn't. It's like, and that's where I just go, that'd be one thing if it was only pragmatic, but it's really biblical. So to me, that's the connection, the gospel in the end is a rehumanization project. So we need to be fuller human beings in the midst of this and understand Jesus is the only one that saved us to be that. So. Again, I think your whole theology of the Bible really affects this. But in the end, eschatology is essentially, Revelation 20:21 is the reconnecting of heaven and earth, which is essentially then the expulsion of sin. So the way I help people think about this all the time is we'll say, so we're doing this interview at the end of a day, and you could say to somebody, what would your life have looked like today if sin were not present? And it really creates this amazing moment for them to reflect upon, and you'll give them a lot of time. Reflect upon it, journal about it. What would it look like if sin were not present? And then when you can say to them, that is the new heavens and the new earth. Like the new heavens and the new earth, the way the Bible speaks about it, is the real world, heaven coming to earth, expelling sin, Christ is Lord, but it's real life. Like, my street's really going to be there, these streets are really going to be, but sin's not going to be present. So what that's going to be like is colors are going to shine brighter, there's not going to be gross injustices, and people are going to work heartily. I mean, work is still in the midst of the kingdom. So when you give people that vision of that's what it is, and then you say essentially the church is the eschatological people, saying to the world, this is where God's taking history in the end, even though sin's still present, it helps them go like, you're going to do this forever. I mean, one of my favorite passages on this is in 1 Corinthians 15, which is the most prominent passage on the resurrection in all the Bible. The way most people have been taught is they would think Paul speaks about the resurrection and he's defending not the resurrection of Christ, but the resurrection of Christ means the resurrection of all of us and our bodies. And you'd think at the end of it, he'd say, therefore have hope, like you're going to live forever, right? He doesn't end the chapter that way. He ends the chapter by saying, therefore be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor's not in vain, right? Well, traditional churches would go, well, always abounding in the work of the Lord, that's evangelism, whatever. But if you take everything we've just said, it's like, no, this is your all of life, Romans 12, everything in your body, spiritual worship, that's all physical. And he's saying somehow, and I don't want to make sense of this because he doesn't, but somehow the labor you're doing now is not in vain, meaning it will carry over. I have no idea how that, because he doesn't give us that, but some way it does. So I think those two visions, what does life look like without sin, and the fact that it matters, eternally matters, is something to ponder and I think is really empowering. I think the only way you could possibly say that is if you had such a rich view of life right now and that God does think planting a tree is worship. I think that if that statement's true, it digs immediately at much what's been called Christian or maybe evangelical theology and goes, because that is not the way typical people, the world's burning, everybody needs to know about Jesus. You'd go, if I knew Jesus would come back tomorrow, I wouldn't go to work tomorrow, and I'd go around my streets telling everybody about Jesus, which I think we should tell everybody about Jesus. But Martin Luther clearly is saying something there, which I would tend to agree. That's exactly what he had in mind, is that this really, really matters. And it allows you to enjoy what we call mundane and actually go, no, it's way bigger than mundane. It has eternal significance. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'd say somewhat, I think the answer is in the question of just getting somebody, just say an exercise. For the next 2 weeks, read your Bible through the lens of what you're going to do. If you're reading it at night, read it about what's the next day. So what does this passage have to say about the deal I'm trying to close tomorrow, or the project that I'm working on tomorrow in the midst of my work, and maybe even, or my cleanup around the house on Saturday? I think just the sheer notion of giving people freedom to say, this will say something, and then you probably in there would have to go, and I don't want to give you the freedom to say, I do my work in such a way to try to tell somebody about Jesus. Like, no, I want to know about what your actual work that you're going to do with your mind and with your hands, the actual work. So not like I'm going to do this so somebody can see, just you and your work. What does the Bible have to say about that? And I think they'd be astonished at how much in the Bible, I feel like this is everywhere, and I think it was absolutely Paul's worldview. I think we've just imposed something on the scriptures that have made it unneededly difficult. So some of it is just freeing people to go, that you couldn't read a passage of the Bible and not see it has implications, to what you're doing tomorrow. And I don't even know if implications even seems light, that it literally is baked with meaning for what you're doing tomorrow. So to me, that's what you're trying to just give them the freedom to do. But the way I'm always trying to get people is to slow down long enough and go, what does that word really mean? Like, it's a little like Jesus, you have heard it said, but I tell you, it's kind of the moments of like, okay, you've always understood the mission of the church like this. You've always understood discipleship like this. You've already understood even the statement, they've read it devotionally. You've already understood devotion like this. You've already understood spiritual worship like this. But Paul disagrees because he says it's about your body. Well, immediately it's amazing to me the moments people are like, I never thought of it like that. And it's like, how did you not think about body meaning body? Or you didn't think about all things meaning all things, like that kind of idea. So some of it's just giving them the freedom to slow down long enough and go. I think the last thing I'd say is try to say to them, read the Bible materially, not spiritually. That if he defines spiritual worship as body, then read it materially. If the resurrection's true, read it materially. We've always had this long tradition of things like home visitation, hospital visitation. I'd say immediately workplace visitation. Like, go to your people on the job, see what they do, and try to say to them these things that now we know, try to point it to them as they're experiencing it. Like, let me show you this, how this is loving your neighbor. Let me show you how this really matters. And then at some points we're going to go, let me show you why this is problematic. Like, it's not that all of work is of God. Sin's distorted that as well. So, in the same portion of, God giving the cultural mandate, sin comes a few chapters later, and one of the curses of sin is the ground will be infected. And sometimes we don't talk a lot either in the faith that we're working so hard to say to people it's good that we don't always also acknowledge it's like by the sweat of your brow now. So let me give meaning to the sweat of your brow and the fact that it's still good and work's still good. So workplace visitation. The other one of our pastors has done recently is a member of their congregation was really struggling making the connection between in saying, it wasn't so much the connection that the work was meaningful, but how do I prepare myself to walk into this like this? Like I start getting so overwhelmed by what I'm going to do. I don't think about God a lot. And so the pastor said, well, let me take the drive with you to work. I'll pick you up in my car. And as we drive, give ourselves a little bit more time. And then he thought about like the Psalms of Ascent. So the Psalms of Ascent were the Psalms that were being sung as you entered into worship. And if we're saying work is worship, then let's make a liturgy of ascent to your job place. So they literally, as they drove, were pointing out things that would remind them of God and making the connection to where they would ultimately be going. I mean, very much like the temple is now all of creation. This is a whole nother part of theology we'd have to say, which means your work is a means of where you're going to worship. So the preparation of somebody moving unto work like that would be another level. I'll say two more real quick. One is then bringing into your worship opportunities where people can talk about their work. So ideas of like, we do these things called all of life interviews. So working really hard to connect Sunday to Monday, bring it in there. But then the last one that I've been challenged recently by is we're working really hard to connect Sunday to Monday. But if we really think through this theology, there's got to be a means in which people can bring their work into literal corporate worship of the church and trying to go, what does that mean? And what does that look like of people bringing that in? So those would be four ways: visitation, helping people prepare to go to work, bringing it, things into their worship to help make a connection, but then literally, how do we help people say what you've done this week you can almost bring as your offerings to God, whether that's helping train them when we're praying individually that they go, God, I'm offering this to you or whatever. But